Grandma Eleanor had lived in Willow Hills long before the manicured lawns, before the uniform mailboxes, before the strict HOA newsletter that arrived every first Monday like a passive-aggressive declaration of authority. Her home, perched at the far end of the cul-de-sac, looked nothing like the polished, copy-paste houses that surrounded it, where modern neighbors had beige sidings and identical garage doors. Her place was a time capsule of weathered wood, deep green shutters, and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. To the HOA, it was an eyesore. To her, it was history. And to the entire neighborhood, though they didn't know it yet, it was the most important piece of land in the community. For decades, the house stood peacefully, protected by nothing more than the strength of Eleanor's routine and the familiarity of old age. But things changed when a new HOA president moved in, a woman known around the community as Karen Sterling, a figure whose rigid posture and icy smile promised confrontation long before any words came out of her mouth. She wasn't like the previous HOA heads who mostly organized bake sales and politely worded reminders about trash day. Karen arrived with a mission: to bring Willow Hills up to modern standards, a phrase she repeated so often it became her personal brand. And according to her, the first thing that needed to go was Grandma's outdated relic of a home. The complaints started subtly: anonymous letters about chipped paint, notes about overgrown shrubs, a printed warning taped to her door about the porch swing being a safety hazard. But when those didn't push Grandma out, Karen escalated. She began parading around the neighborhood with her clipboard, gathering signatures from residents who believed property values were being dragged down by having an old home on the street. She pushed council members, pressured board meetings, and made sure every rule in the HOA handbook, especially the ones no one had ever bothered enforcing, was suddenly applied with hostile precision. Each week brought a new violation notice, each one written with an urgency that suggested Grandma was committing a crime rather than simply aging in place. The neighbors, though mostly kind people, grew uneasy. Some supported the HOA for fear of fines. Others silently disagreed but kept their heads low. And through all of this, Grandma remained calm, moving through her daily routine with the slow, deliberate peace of someone who had seen worse storms. She tended to her garden, watered the rose bushes planted decades earlier, and sat on her creaking swing as if nothing had changed. But what she never told anyone, not even her own family, was that Willow Hills was built on land that once belonged entirely to her, and the deed beneath her home held a secret that the HOA would never expect. Karen, however, mistook Grandma's silence for weakness. During one particularly tense week, she arranged for official eviction notices to be delivered. Property condition unacceptable, the papers claimed. Community standards compromised. Of course, none of these claims were legally enforceable, but that didn't stop Karen from pushing her agenda as aggressively as possible. She strutted around the neighborhood that day like she had already won, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of honor. Word spread quickly. Phones buzzed, curtains shifted, neighbors whispered from porches. Some felt bad, others felt awkward, and a few felt satisfied. But everyone felt something. That was how intense the atmosphere became. Meanwhile, Grandma simply folded the eviction notice, placed it neatly on her kitchen table, and brewed herself a cup of tea. She wasn't worried, not even a little, because in her drawer, tucked beneath decades of family photos, birth certificates, and faded letters, there was a document older than the HOA itself, one that stated, in unmistakably clear legal terms, that she owned not just her home, but the land underneath every single house in Willow Hills. The neighborhood wasn't built on a typical subdivision model. Long before the developers arrived, the land was part of Eleanor's grandfather's estate, an old family property passed down through generations. When construction companies negotiated development rights, they purchased permission to build, but never bought the land outright. A long-term land lease was created, one that still had many years left. And though the HOA had changed leadership countless times, no one had bothered to look beyond the paperwork that came with their roles. No one except Eleanor. For decades, she paid attention quietly, renewing documents, maintaining the family records, ensuring the agreement never expired. It gave her a sense of peace, knowing her family's legacy lived on in the roots of every foundation around her. And she never flaunted it, never used it for power, never interfered with the community. Until now. As pressure from the HOA mounted, threats, letters, attempts to intimidate Grandma's grandchildren, including me, became increasingly anxious. We tried reasoning with the board, explaining her age, her long history in the community, the unfairness of targeting a senior, but Karen wasn't interested. To her, rules were rules, and old houses didn't belong in modern, value-driven neighborhoods. She wanted a makeover for Willow Hills, and she wanted it fast. And so came the day, everything snapped. Early on a Saturday morning, Karen returned with a crew carrying measuring tapes, cameras, and bright orange inspection tags. She marched to Grandma's porch with the authority of a queen inspecting her kingdom. The neighbors peeked from their windows, unsure whether to watch, intervene, or pretend they saw nothing. The HOA team paced the property line, marking supposed violations with stickers like they were tagging items for clearance at a store. They measured the porch steps, the fence height, the distance between the mailbox and sidewalk, and when they were done, Karen declared the home uninhabitable according to community standards and gave Grandma 30 days to leave the property. That was the moment I saw something change in my grandmother's eyes, a stillness deeper than calm, like a mountain settling before it shifts. She stood from her porch swing, straightened her back, and walked inside without a word. Karen assumed it was resignation. I knew better. Inside, Grandma opened the old drawer, quietly pulled out the documents she had kept safe for nearly her entire life, and placed them on the kitchen table. She sat beside them, ran her fingers over the embossed seal, and let out a long breath, not of defeat, but of resolve. She had hoped it would never come to this. She had hoped the HOA would be reasonable, respectful, humane. But if they wanted a war, they had chosen the wrong opponent. By the time the sun set that evening, the house that once looked vulnerable now felt like the eye of a storm, quiet, but holding a force no one could see. And as neighbors settled in for the night, unaware of the twist about to shake their entire community, Grandma prepared the first move in a plan that would turn Willow Hills upside down, because she wasn't leaving. And soon, the HOA would learn exactly why they had made the biggest mistake of their lives, trying to evict the one person who still owned the very ground they walked on. The morning after the HOA's attempted eviction, Willow Hills woke to a quiet tension that settled over the neighborhood like an early fog, visible to no one, yet felt by everyone. Most residents went about their routines, believing they had witnessed the peak of the drama the day before, thinking the matter was settled, and that the old house at the end of the cul-de-sac would soon be cleared away and replaced with something fresh, something modern, something that aligned with the pristine image the HOA had in mind. But what they didn't know was that the real beginning was only just unfolding inside the wooden walls of that old house, where Grandma Eleanor sat at her oak table, surrounded by documents older than most of the residents themselves. Those papers, some yellowed, some crisp, all meticulously preserved, spelled out a truth that would shake the entire community. That the land beneath every home, every driveway, every sidewalk, and every HOA-mandated flower bed still belonged to her. Overnight, she had laid out maps, contracts, land surveys, original signatures from developers long deceased, and renewal stamps that proved she had maintained ownership through more than half a century. Most people her age couldn't keep track of their utility bills, but Eleanor had safeguarded a legal legacy with the precision of an archivist and the quiet foresight of someone who understood that land, not buildings, held real power. She reviewed each document slowly, double-checking dates, clauses, and renewal intervals. The land lease had more than 27 years left on it, legally unbreakable, binding, and ironclad. The HOA had no authority over her home, no right to impose standards, and certainly no power to evict her. In truth, if she wanted to, she could have charged the HOA ground rent for every inch of the community. That wasn't her goal, not yet. She had lived peacefully for decades and never once leveraged her ownership against anyone. But after the cruelty, disrespect, and public humiliation she endured, the time for peace had ended. Her plan wasn't revenge, it was restoration. She wanted balance, fairness, and respect returned to Willow Hills. But she knew the HOA, especially Karen, wouldn't accept this quietly. By mid-morning, word had spread that Grandma hadn't responded to the eviction notice and hadn't left her house trembling with fear the way the HOA had expected. Karen, whose leadership style depended entirely on intimidation and compliance, did not like being ignored. So she returned to the house, clipboard in hand, ready to escalate. What she didn't know was that Grandma had already contacted a local land use attorney, a man familiar with unique cases, who confirmed everything she already knew. Not only was her ownership legitimate, but the HOA had placed itself in a catastrophic legal position by attempting to evict a landowner from property built on her own land. While the attorney prepared official notices and documentation, Grandma prepared her own version of action, a quieter, more strategic step that would set the tone for everything to come. She walked outside, not to confront anyone, but to water her roses. They were deep red, glowing in the sunlight, rooted in soil that had belonged to her family for over a century. Neighbors walking their dogs glanced in her direction, some with pity, some with confusion, some with that peculiar curiosity people get when they sense a drama they can't quite understand yet. They didn't know that the HOA's entire world was about to tilt. When Karen arrived, she marched through the street with her usual entourage board members, who followed her like nervous interns and stopped at the edge of the walkway, clearly expecting fear or apology. Instead, she found a woman grounded in absolute calm, standing on land no board meeting could take away. She left angrier than she arrived. She threatened further action. She promised consequences. She hinted at legal pressure she didn't actually have. But by noon, the first official letter from Grandma's attorney reached the HOA office. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply factual, referencing legal codes, historical documentation, land ownership statutes, and the consequences of attempting to evict a landowner from her own leased domain. When the HOA read the letter, confusion spread through the boardroom like wildfire. Land ownership, developer leases, rights dating back to the original estate. No one on the current board had ever even heard of such a thing. Panic followed confusion. Some members urged caution, others wanted to verify. A few accused Karen of overreaching, seeing the situation as a threat to their reputations. But Karen, driven by ego and the desperation to maintain control, insisted the letter must be wrong, outdated, forged, or irrelevant. She believed authority came from rules, not roots. So she doubled down. She announced an emergency board meeting for the evening, inviting only those she trusted to support her agenda. But while she schemed, Grandma positioned herself for the next step, full exposure. That afternoon, she printed copies of key documents and handed them to a few longtime neighbors who had always treated her kindly. She didn't ask them to take sides. She simply wanted them informed. And information spreads faster than gossip when it contradicts everything people thought they understood. By sunset, quiet conversations hummed across porches. Could it be true? Did Eleanor really own the land? If so, what did it mean for all of them? Some were thrilled at the idea of the HOA finally being put in its place. Others were terrified. What did this mean for their mortgages, their property rights, their security? But the truth was both simpler and more powerful than anyone realized. Nothing would change unless the HOA forced change. The flaws in the system only mattered because Karen had pushed too far. At 7 p.m., the HOA gathered for their emergency meeting. But unlike usual gatherings filled with cookie trays and polite nodding, this one felt like a courtroom without a judge. The boardroom buzzed with concern, tension, and whispered accusations. Some demanded Karen step down. Others worried lawsuits would empty the HOA reserves. A few insisted they needed to negotiate with Eleanor immediately before things got worse. And still, some mostly Karen loyalists believed they could overpower an old woman with enough legal threats. But their illusion of control shattered when Grandma's attorney arrived unannounced with a formal land deed copy in hand. It had the original seals, signatures, and legal language that made every jaw in the room drop. The evidence wasn't just valid, it was bulletproof. The room fell silent, not a whisper, not a breath. Just the heavy realization that their authority had never extended to Eleanor's property in the first place. And worse, by overstepping, they had triggered a legal battle they would inevitably lose. But the true disaster wasn't legal, it was reputational. Because someone leaked the meeting turnout and the revelation to the residents outside. As people gathered, murmurs turned into waves of emotion, some in disbelief, some in relief, many in outrage at the HOA for going after a woman who literally held the land beneath the entire neighborhood. Phones came out, videos were recorded, social media posts sparked, screenshots circulated. Every moment of the unraveling spread through group chats faster than Karen could attempt damage control. For the first time, she wasn't feared, she was seen, exposed, questioned, and that loss of power inflicted a wound deeper than any legal threat possibly could. Meanwhile, in her quiet kitchen, Grandma brewed another cup of tea. She wasn't celebrating, she wasn't gloating, she simply waited for the next phase to begin. She knew the HOA wouldn't surrender gracefully. Pride was a powerful force, and Karen's pride was taller than the HOA's sign at the community entrance. As night fell over Willow Hills, the neighborhood felt different, like a foundation shift before an earthquake. People knew something massive had happened, even if they didn't yet understand the full consequences. They sensed a reversal of power. They sensed the end of the HOA's unchecked authority. And above all, they sensed that the quiet old woman at the end of the cul-de-sac held more strength than any of them had ever imagined. Inside her home, Eleanor closed her folders, extinguished the living room lamp, and paused at the window overlooking the silent street. The war had not yet begun, but the ground beneath Willow Hills had already changed. By sunrise, the following morning, Willow Hills was already murmuring like a hive disturbed in the night. Wherever one walked down Tulip Lane, past Pear Blossom Drive, around the Central Park, conversations drifted through the crisp air, filled with disbelief, curiosity, and a spreading sense of rebellion that no one could have predicted only 72 hours earlier. Phones buzzed nonstop as screenshots of the land deed, the HOA panic meeting, and blurry photos of Karen's furious expression made their way through neighborhood group chats. Residents who had lived in the community for years, without ever glancing at an HOA document, suddenly found themselves reading every clause, every rule, every bylaw that had once governed their lives. The realization hit them collectively. The HOA had never been as powerful as it pretended to be. Their authority was built on compliance, not legality, and that thin veneer of control had cracked open the moment Grandma Eleanor's land ownership surfaced. For the first time, residents questioned everything: why they paid such high fees, why the HOA fined families for trivial violations, why they allowed a board to dictate what color blinds they could hang in their homes. The power dynamic that had felt unshakable only days earlier now seemed fragile, flimsy, built on assumptions rather than truth. And the person responsible for lifting that veil of illusion was the woman who lived quietly at the end of the cul-de-sac. As neighbors woke that morning, many felt something they hadn't felt in years: courage. They walked past the HOA office more boldly, no longer tiptoeing like intimidated students before a strict teacher. They spoke openly, expressing frustrations they had buried under fear of retaliation. Fines for leaving trash bins out an extra hour, threats for mismatched holiday lights, warnings for having garden gnomes that were not in theme, penalties for having a fence 1 inch taller than allowed. All those burdensome rules suddenly felt absurd when framed against the truth. The person being targeted by the HOA was the one who held the land beneath them all. Meanwhile, inside her home, Eleanor moved with her usual calm, but her heart felt heavier, fuller, carrying decades of memories that had now resurfaced. She remembered her childhood on this land, when the estate was nothing but fields, cattle, and fruit trees. She remembered her parents signing the initial development agreement, believing the neighborhood would grow into something beautiful, never imagining it would one day be governed by an organization that valued uniformity over humanity. But she also remembered every time she renewed the land lease, every time she offered the developers lenient terms, every time she preserved the estate's boundaries. And now, after all these years, she finally saw why her father had insisted the land remain in the family, not for wealth, not for power, but for protection. Protection for the people who lived on it. Protection against those who would abuse authority. Protection against exactly the kind of overreach the HOA had become notorious for. By mid-morning, small clusters of neighbors began walking toward her house not to intrude, but to show support. Some brought food, some brought flowers, some simply left handwritten notes thanking her for standing up in a way none of them felt brave enough to do. She appreciated every gesture, but she knew the real battle hadn't even begun. Because while the residents were awakening, the HOA was imploding behind closed doors. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with tension. Board members argued, accused one another of incompetence, blamed Karen for dragging them into a legal disaster that could bankrupt the association. Financial reports were pulled up, showing reserves that were far too small to survive a lawsuit. Liability documents were stacked on the table. Some board members suggested resigning altogether to escape responsibility, while others scrambled to craft a narrative that would make them appear like victims rather than aggressors. And then there was Karen. She wasn't crumbling with the rest of them. She wasn't shaken, wasn't remorseful, wasn't reconsidering her actions. Instead, she was becoming more dangerous. Her determination hardened into an obsession. She refused to believe she had been outplayed by an elderly woman. She refused to accept the possibility of losing authority. She refused to let go of the fantasy that she controlled the fate of Willow Hills. That mindset blinded her to reality. While her board panicked, she doubled down on strategy. She convinced herself that the land deed could be challenged, that ownership could be contested, that loopholes surely existed somewhere. And so, instead of backing down, she decided to escalate the conflict, not legally, but socially. She began spreading rumors that Eleanor's documents were fraudulent, that she had somehow manipulated history, that she was planning to charge residents outrageous fees to remain on her land. Fear-mongering was a desperate tactic, but fear had always been her most effective weapon. And for some residents, those who rarely questioned authority or feared any change, it worked. A small, vocal group emerged, demanding proof, demanding clarity, demanding reassurance that their homes weren't at risk. They panicked in online forums, claiming the neighborhood would collapse, that mortgages would become invalid, that property values would plummet. Their anxieties spilled into real life as they marched to the HOA office, demanding answers. The community was splitting, those who saw Eleanor as a hero, and those who saw her as a threat simply because Karen said so. But even the fearful group couldn't help noticing the cracks in Karen's story. Why had she never mentioned land ownership before? Why had she been so quick to issue an eviction? Why did the board seem more concerned about legal fallout than supporting her narrative? The uneasiness spread further when a few residents contacted independent title offices and discovered that the land deed indeed traced back to Eleanor's family. The facts were aligning, and the more truth emerged, the more Karen's control slipped away. Meanwhile, Eleanor prepared for the next step, not to divide the neighborhood, but to protect it from collapsing under the HOA's desperation. She met again with her attorney, discussing not only her rights, but the rights of every resident. She wanted a resolution that maintained stability, ensured no families suffered, and restored balance without ripping apart the community. But that plan depended entirely on whether the HOA backed down peacefully, which seemed increasingly unlikely. That evening, when the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across driveways, a crowd of nearly 50 residents gathered in the main park. They weren't there for a scheduled event. They weren't there for an HOA meeting. They were there because the community had reached a breaking point. For the first time in Willow Hill's history, the residents held their own meeting without the HOA. Word spread quickly. More families joined. Children played near the benches while adults discussed the future of their neighborhood. Some wanted the HOA disbanded entirely. Some wanted new leadership. Some wanted clearer rules. But all agreed on one thing. Karen had overstepped, and the HOA had lost their trust. When news of this unsanctioned gathering reached Karen, her fury erupted. She rushed to the park, determined to reassert authority, but the moment she arrived, she realized something terrifying. No one listened. The crowd didn't disperse. They didn't quiet down. They didn't flinch. They stood firm, unified by the shared understanding that the board held no real power now. The sight shook her more than she let on, but instead of reflecting, she vowed to regain control at any cost. And as she stormed away from the park with blistering rage, the residents continued discussing their future, one that might not include the HOA at all. Back at her home, Eleanor watched from her window as people passed by, the community alive with energy, resistance, and hope. She felt relieved knowing they were waking up, but she also sensed the turbulence ahead. This wasn't over. The HOA still held the keys to community operations, and Karen still held the stubborn belief that she could restore her rule. And tomorrow, she knew, the conflict would rise to a new level, one that would test every resident, every belief, every hidden truth buried beneath Willow Hills. The fourth day of the escalating conflict dawned with a kind of electric tension that seeped into every corner of Willow Hills, an unease so thick it seemed woven into the air itself. Even the morning sunlight felt sharper, as if the neighborhood had shifted into a new, unfamiliar version of itself. Residents opened blinds cautiously, stepping onto porches with a wariness usually reserved for incoming storms. No one knew what the HOA would do next. No one trusted that they would act reasonably. And beneath every whispered conversation lay the same question. What happens when a system that is ruled by intimidation realizes its power is gone? By 9 a.m., the answer began making itself known. The HOA office, usually a quiet building where board employees idled behind counters, had transformed into the epicenter of chaos. Cars crowded the parking lot. Residents who had once accepted every fine, every warning, every rule now stormed into the office, demanding explanations for years of unfair treatment. They brought printed photos of past violations, highlighted letters, receipts for fines they believed were unjust. The stack of complaints piled higher than the HOA printer, toppling over as frantic board members tried to organize the mess. Fear replaced arrogance. Confusion replaced certainty. And, above all, panic replaced pride. Every board member except Karen seemed shaken to their core. They checked their email inboxes anxiously, finding message after message titled with phrases like request for refund, demand for investigation, or formal complaint of harassment. The HOA hotline, which usually received little more than the occasional landscaping question, rang non-stop, with residents furious about the revelation that the land they lived on belonged to someone the HOA had targeted. But Karen, blinded by stubbornness and the desperate desire to maintain her image, refused to acknowledge the collapse around her. Instead, she secluded herself in the boardroom with legal books spread across the table, flipping through statutes she barely understood. She scribbled notes furiously, searching for any angle, no matter how weak that could discredit Eleanor's land ownership. In her mind, this wasn't just a legal issue, it was personal. She couldn't accept that a woman she saw as outdated and irrelevant held power Karen never possessed. She couldn't accept that she had made the wrong move. She couldn't accept that the authority she wielded so confidently had been nothing more than a facade. And so she crafted a new plan, one built not on real legal footing, but on intimidation, misdirection, and misinformation. While the board panicked, she drafted a neighborhood-wide announcement claiming that the land deed was under investigation, that residents should remain cautious, and that the HOA was working to protect their property values. The wording was carefully crafted to ignite fear without stating anything concrete. She intended to regain control through uncertainty, but her plan failed before it even started. Because that morning, Eleanor's attorney sent a full legal packet to each resident's mailbox. The envelope contained copies of the original land deed, an explanation of the decades-old development agreement, and a detailed breakdown of how the HOA had zero authority over Eleanor's property. It also clarified that the residents were not at risk, that their mortgages were valid, their homes secure, and that the HOA's attempt to weaponize fear was both unethical and illegal. When residents received the packet, the neighborhood erupted again, but this time with clarity. The anxiety Karen hoped to stoke flipped into outrage. People marched across lawns, waving the documents, showing neighbors, debunking rumors, calling out the HOA's manipulative tactics in group chats and community forums. Everything Karen had hoped to control slipped even further beyond her reach. By noon, residents gathered again, this time twice as many as the previous day, filling the park in a spontaneous assembly. They discussed dissolving the HOA entirely, electing new leadership, or forcing Karen to resign immediately. What had begun as a quiet rebellion had turned into an organized movement. Meanwhile, in her small wooden house at the edge of the cul-de-sac, Eleanor prepared for the first direct confrontation. She spread out the legal packets again, making notes on the margins, not for her attorney, but for herself. She wanted to be ready not with aggression, but with wisdom. She had survived the hardest chapters of life, raising children alone, losing her husband, navigating financial hardships, preserving the family land through decades of development pressure. She understood resilience better than anyone in Willow Hills. And while she didn't enjoy conflict, she recognized that sometimes peace required protection, and sometimes protection required strength. As the afternoon sun rose higher, casting sharp shadows across the driveways, the HOA board called an emergency closed meeting, this time without Karen's knowledge. The board members, exhausted and overwhelmed, had reached their limit. They could no longer support a leader who had dragged them into disaster. Many feared legal consequences. Some feared losing their homes if the HOA dissolved without proper transition. A few simply felt guilty, ashamed for not questioning Karen's methods earlier. And so they took a vote. An internal, secret vote. A unanimous vote to remove Karen as HOA president. It was the first bold move the board had made in years. And it came too late to save their reputation, but it was a step towards survival. When Karen arrived at the office and discovered what the board had done, her fury exploded in a way the neighborhood had never seen. She stormed through the halls, slamming doors, shouting accusations at the board members who refused to make eye contact. She demanded the vote be reversed. She claimed they had no authority to remove her. She insisted she was the only one capable of saving the community. But the board stood firm. They presented her with the documented vote, the bylaws supporting their decision, and a termination letter signed by every member. For the first time, Karen was powerless. But instead of leaving, she made one final, reckless decision, one driven by pride and desperation, not strategy. She marched straight toward Eleanor's house. Residents watched as she stomped across the cul-de-sac, her face twisted with rage, her steps so forceful that gravel kicked up behind her like sparks. The neighborhood followed from a distance, forming a silent crowd along the sidewalks. Everyone sensed what was coming. Everyone knew this confrontation would define what happened next. And everyone wondered whether Karen would finally break or whether she would unleash something even more dangerous. Inside her home, Eleanor sensed the shift in the air, the kind of shift that precedes a storm's arrival. She stood from her kitchen chair, steady and unafraid, ready to face whatever came next. As Karen's shadow stretched across the porch and the watching neighborhood held its breath, the fourth chapter of the conflict reached a turning point. The HOA had fallen, the neighborhood had awakened, but Karen had not yet surrendered, and the storm approaching Eleanor's doorstep would push Willow Hills into the most explosive moment it had ever seen. The morning after the emergency meeting, the entire community pulsed with an unsettled tension that felt thick enough to taste. The air carried a strange silence, one born not from peace, but from fear disguised as quiet compliance. Homeowners lingered behind curtains, blinds twitching as they waited for the latest clash between my grandmother and the HOA council. Word had already spread about the legal documents she unveiled, about the way Karen's confidence faltered for the first time. But Grandma wasn't interested in gloating or parading her advantage. Instead, she walked onto her property at sunrise with a purpose only she understood, her boots sinking softly into the damp earth. She surveyed the land with eyes sharpened by years of memory, knowledge, and a private urgency no one else seemed able to detect. Something was shifting beneath the surface, literally and metaphorically, and she knew it had to be addressed before the HOA managed to twist their narrative again. What the community didn't know was that the land they lived on didn't just belong to her name. It held something deeper, older, and much more dangerous than any policy the HOA could draft. It began as a mild tremor beneath her feet, subtle enough to be mistaken for a passing truck on the main road. But she knew better. The land had been restless for months, shifting in quiet protest under the strain of construction, irrigation, misuse, and unchecked development. The HOA kept approving modifications and expansions, extra patios, backyard pools, new drainage systems, never realizing the deeper consequences of forcing nature into submission. And now, that silence had finally cracked. A low rumble, more felt than heard, passed through the ground as she walked toward the old wellhead on the west side of her property. Grass surrounding it had faded prematurely, turning a sickly yellow, and the soil sagged unnaturally as though the earth was deflating. She knelt, pressed her palm against the ground, and felt it again, a pulse, like a heartbeat, but slower, heavier, wrong. By mid-morning, the tremors grew noticeable enough for the community to panic. Karen marched down the street in a fury, her footsteps loud, her expression stormy as she approached Grandma's home with the entire HOA board trailing behind her like anxious ducklings. They expected to find Grandma cowering, overwhelmed, outnumbered. Instead, she was already working, placing bright flags around the property, marking areas of weakness, points of collapse, and lines of subsidence. The HOA saw only chaos, but she saw a map. When they shouted accusations about violations, unauthorized digging, and disturbing community harmony, she didn't respond. She simply continued pacing out careful measurements, her mind focused on something far more pressing than their theatrics. The real danger was not the HOA's legal bluffs, it was the ground itself, shifting under the weight of years of mismanagement. The first hole opened shortly after noon. A sudden snap, like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake, sent a vibration through the entire neighborhood. Birds scattered, dogs barked, car alarms beeped randomly. Then the earth dipped sharply near Lot 12, the home owned by a young couple who had recently installed a massive in-ground pool without proper inspection. The soil around their backyard caved inward, forming a sinkhole wide enough to swallow the fence. Screams echoed through the community as neighbors rushed outside, terrified. Karen tried maintaining composure, shouting orders like a frantic general, losing control of her troops, but panic spread too quickly. People looked to her, expecting leadership, but her eyes darted nervously toward Grandma, who was standing near the property line with a grim, knowing expression. She wasn't surprised, not even a little, because she knew exactly what was happening, and it was only the beginning. As the HOA scrambled to organize themselves, Grandma walked toward the center of the growing commotion. She moved with calm certainty, the kind that immediately drew attention away from Karen's flustered outbursts. Her boots crunched over brittle grass as she approached the edge of the sinkhole. While others kept a wide distance, she knelt again, studying the break patterns in the soil, the layering of sediment, the water seepage pooling at the bottom. The ground was speaking in its own language, a language she understood, with the intimate familiarity of someone who had lived her entire life listening to it. The HOA accused her of tampering with irrigation systems. They accused her of destabilizing the land to stage political leverage. They even threatened to call the county inspectors. But their threats rang hollow as the earth gave another deep groan somewhere near the walking trail, followed by another small collapse. People gasped, fear rippled across the community, and suddenly, Karen's voice began to lose its authoritarian edge. That was when the homeowners finally turned not to Karen, but to Grandma. Not because she held legal power, not because she exposed the HOA, but because she was the only one who understood what was actually happening. As a crowd gathered around her, she finally spoke, explaining the truth that had been building for years, that the land beneath the neighborhood wasn't stable enough to endure the reckless overdevelopment approved by the HOA, that underground water veins had been rerouted and overtaxed, that the foundation of the entire community, built on old agricultural land originally belonging to her family, was beginning to shift under pressure. It wasn't a disaster born of nature alone. It was a disaster created by arrogance, shortcuts, and profit. But Karen refused to accept this reality. She stormed forward, pointing to the deed in Grandma's hands, shouting that none of this mattered because the HOA is in charge here. She demanded compliance, demanded silence, demanded respect, but her words wobbled, undermining themselves. Because the ground trembled again, this time harder, forcing everyone to grab onto something for balance. A deep groaning sound rose from beneath the earth, vibrating through every home. Cracks crawled across driveways and sidewalks like living scars. Someone shouted to evacuate. Someone else yelled to call the fire department. Children cried while their parents tried desperately to stay calm. In the chaos, one fact became painfully, undeniably clear. The HOA had no idea what they were doing, and for the first time, everyone saw it. Karen's authority crumbled faster than the soil beneath her manicured lawn. She tried to restore order, but her voice grew small as neighbors confronted her, some angry, some terrified, but all demanding answers she didn't have. Meanwhile, Grandma remained steady, the single unmoving pillar amid the chaos. Her presence grounded people more than the land itself could. And so, in a moment that shifted the entire dynamic of the community, the homeowners collectively turned to her, not Karen, for guidance. She led them, directing where to stand, where to avoid walking, where to brace with sandbags, and which utilities needed to be shut off. Even the emergency responders who arrived minutes later listened to her with quiet respect after realizing her knowledge wasn't guesswork, but expertise passed down through generations. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, the shuddering finally slowed, not completely, not safely, but enough for the neighborhood to breathe. Enough for the community to recognize that they had been following the wrong leader all along. Karen, watching her power slip through her fingers, glared at Grandma with a venomous mix of humiliation and fury. But even she couldn't deny the truth. The land was failing, and the only person who knew how to read it was the woman she had tried so hard to evict. And beneath that truth lingered a darker realization this wasn't just a temporary crisis. This was a warning, a sign of something much bigger still coming. As the emergency crews continued stabilizing the area, Grandma stared toward the horizon with a quiet heaviness in her expression. The land was speaking louder than ever, and she knew that if the HOA refused to change, the entire community might soon face a collapse far greater than they could imagine. The chapter closed, not with resolution, but with the unsettling knowledge that the ground beneath them had only just begun to reveal its secrets and consequences. And, as night settled over the trembling neighborhood, one question remained hanging in the air. What would give way next, the land, or the last threads of Karen's crumbling authority? The night settled over the fractured neighborhood with a heaviness that felt almost physical, as though darkness itself had weight and intention. Every home glowed with uneasy lights, windows illuminated by the flicker of televisions left on for comfort, or the harsh beams of flashlights sweeping repeatedly across floors to check for further cracks. The tremors had quieted, but quiet did not mean safety. It meant suspense, a pause, a deep inhale before whatever came next. And everyone felt it, the waiting, the uncertainty, the unspoken fear threaded through the streets like an invisible fog. Emergency vehicles had left. Neighbors returned to their homes, but no one truly relaxed. The earth beneath them had proven its instability, and now every groan of the wind, every shift of a floorboard, every distant thud sent hearts racing and nerves spiraling. My grandmother stood on her porch, overlooking the community she had watched rise over her family's land, the night wind brushing strands of gray hair across her face. She had seen the land restless before, but this time felt different, more personal, more vengeful, as if the ground itself remembered the disrespect it had endured under HOA mismanagement. She watched lights flicker in kitchen windows and silhouettes move behind curtains. For the first time in years, the community wasn't hiding from her, they were watching her, waiting for what she would do next. Meanwhile, Karen paced inside her home, fuming, shaken, and obsessed with regaining control. She refused to accept the blow to her authority, refused to acknowledge that the neighborhood no longer saw her as a reliable leader. It infuriated her that people sought guidance from the very woman she had spent months trying to remove. She replayed the day's events obsessively, the sinkholes, the panic, the humiliation, and the more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself that Grandma was responsible. In Karen's mind, Grandma had orchestrated everything, the land instability, the sinkholes, the panic, because the alternative explanation would mean admitting fault, and Karen had never admitted fault in her life. Outside, the night deepened until it became a velvet black blanket stretching over the trembling ground. The moon cast a faint glow across the cracked pavement, illuminating the fragile seams running across driveways and the shadows of caution tape still fluttering around damaged areas. In the center of the neighborhood, near Lot 12, the second sinkhole sat like an open wound, surrounded by temporary barriers the fire department had hastily set up. It was quiet, but not calm, eerily still, like a predator waiting. It was near midnight when the first strange sound echoed through the silence, a low hum vibrating through the soil. Grandma felt it before she heard it, a subtle shift under her boots as she stood at the edge of her property, surveying the land with a lantern in hand. The hum grew stronger, resonating through the foundations of nearby homes. Lights flickered again, this time synchronously, unnervingly. A few neighbors stepped onto their porches in alarm. Dogs barked. A car alarm wailed briefly. Something was happening beneath the surface, and whatever it wasn't small. Grandma stepped off her porch just as a sudden crack split the quiet, a sharp, echoing crack that shot through the east side of the neighborhood like lightning striking the ground. A line of asphalt peeled upward along Maple Crest Lane, ripping apart a sidewalk in one swift motion. People screamed and stumbled out of their homes as lights flickered violently. Porch railings shook, windows rattled, and small chunks of dirt vibrated loose from the cliffs of the earlier sinkholes. Karen burst outside in a panic, holding a flashlight that shook in her hand. She tried shouting commands, but her voice was drowned out by another deep groan from the earth, louder than anything they had heard earlier that day. The land wasn't just shifting now, it was reacting. It was warning. It was angry. Grandma moved toward the street with steady, purposeful strides, lantern lighting her path. The moment she appeared, neighbors instinctively clustered around her, not in fear, but in desperate dependence. People gravitated to the one person who seemed unshaken, the one who seemed to know what the restless ground was trying to say. She examined the new crack, pressing a hand against the crumbling edge, feeling the vibrations travel up her arm. The land was breathing unevenly, collapsing in some places, swelling in others. It wasn't random. It was structured, patterned, like something beneath the surface was shifting in a chain reaction. She quietly marked mental calculations: depth, direction, pressure points. The HOA's installations had redirected underground water flows in a way that created false pressure pockets beneath the neighborhood. The slightest disturbance was enough to trigger movement, and the tremors from earlier had awakened every weak point at once. Karen stormed over, pointing aggressively at the ground, shouting accusations that Grandma was interfering, tampering, making things worse. But the neighbors didn't move. They didn't listen. They didn't even look at Karen. They stood around Grandma like a protective circle, their faces anxious, pleading, trusting. Karen's fury grew with every ignored command. Her authority was not slipping, it was evaporating. Before she could launch into another tirade, another thunderous crack split the night, this one farther away, near the nature trail that bordered the community. A plume of dirt shot upward like a geyser. Lights flickered again, some going out completely. A chorus of terrified gasps rippled through the neighborhood. Grandma raised her lantern higher, scanning the darkness. This wasn't sustainable. The entire neighborhood was becoming unstable. If the chain reaction continued, the land could undergo a partial collapse, dragging homes into the soil with it. Emergency services weren't equipped to understand or manage something this complex, but she could, because she knew the land's original shape, its unaltered pathways, its flow. She called for everyone to gather in the central cul-de-sac, where the ground was thickest and least disturbed. People followed her instantly. Even the families who had moved in recently clung to her leadership as though she were a lifeline. And in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. The community trusted the landowner more than the HOA. Karen stood alone on the sidelines, flashlight trembling, watching her influence dissolve. But she didn't crumble the way the land had. She recalculated. She schemed. She watched Grandma guide the community into a safer formation, using her ancestral understanding of the land to keep people away from fracture zones. And Karen's eyes narrowed. If Grandma became the neighborhood's savior, the HOA would be finished. Her own position would be meaningless. So she decided, in a moment driven by fear, pride, and desperation, to take back control the only way she believed she could. She announced loudly that she was calling an emergency enforcement meeting, and declared that Grandma had violated multiple HOA ordinances by creating public panic. But her voice cracked, not with fear, anger, and no one moved to support her. Not a single board member stood behind her. Even her closest loyalists stepped away, joining the crowd around Grandma instead. That fracture, the fracture in Karen's authority, was deeper and more irreversible than any crack in the asphalt. It broke something inside her. She spun around and stormed back to the HOA office building at the edge of the neighborhood, muttering threats about legal action and violations. And that was when disaster struck. The ground gave one final, violent shudder, strong enough to knock porch decorations over, strong enough to rattle windows in their frames. A deafening roar erupted from the earth beneath the HOA office building. A sinkhole, massive, sudden, devouring, opened directly beneath it. The structure groaned, tilted, and sank halfway into the earth before stopping at an awkward diagonal angle. Dust filled the air. People screamed again. But through the dust, one thing was unmistakably clear. The heart of the HOA had just been swallowed by the land. Karen stood frozen, staring at the half-collapsed office as though reality had betrayed her. The symbol of her authority was sinking literally. Neighbors rushed to help ensure no one was trapped inside, but the building had been empty. No injuries, only devastation, only a message. For a long time, no one spoke. Not out of fear, but realization. This wasn't a normal environmental issue. This was a consequence, a manifestation of decades of ignored warnings, undermined land, and the HOA's disregard for natural stability. And standing at the center of it all was Grandma, lantern glowing, face solemn, voice steady as she told the community that this land was calling for restoration, respect, and immediate action. For the first time, everyone agreed. They were ready to listen, ready to follow, ready to change. But one person was not. One person watched all of this unfold with hatred simmering beneath her panic. One person believed everything happening tonight was a personal attack. Karen stared at Grandma, eyes cold, calculating. And in that moment, the land wasn't the only thing cracking. Something dangerous had awakened inside her. Something personal, something vengeful. And as the neighborhood gathered around Grandma, seeking safety in her guidance, Karen made a silent promise to herself. If the land wasn't enough to bring Grandma down, she would do it herself. Because in her mind, there was only room for one authority in this neighborhood, and she would not lose, not even if the ground itself rebelled beneath her feet. The morning after the HOA office collapsed into the earth, the neighborhood existed in a strange in-between state, a mixture of exhausted relief and creeping dread. The sky was overcast, casting a dull, gray light that made every cracked surface and every patch of sunken soil look worse, more wounded, more permanent. Homeowners wandered the streets with tired faces and uneasy steps, speaking in hushed tones as if the land itself was listening. And in some strange way, it felt like it was. Emergency vehicles and county inspectors had already arrived, weaving through the neighborhood like ants assessing a damaged mound. But even they struggled to fully understand what had happened. They took measurements, photographed the unstable soil, assessed the half-swallowed HOA office, and whispered among themselves with the unmistakable edge of concern. Their confusion only strengthened the community's growing dependence on Grandma, who moved calmly among them with a presence that felt almost protective. She explained what she could, guided people towards safety, and reassured frightened families with a quiet authority that required no shouting, no threats, no rules, only wisdom. The homeowners followed her without hesitation, forming a loose circle around her as she surveyed the land, looking for signs of what might come next. She knew the chain reaction hadn't ended. Sinkholes didn't appear in isolation. Pressure pockets didn't stabilize overnight. The very foundation of the neighborhood had been destabilized not only by poor development choices, but by intentional interference from the HOA over many years. She could see the patterns, the redirected underground water channels, the over-irrigated common areas, the aggressive landscaping that uprooted natural retaining systems. This wasn't an accident. It was a slow-building catastrophe awaiting the right moment to reveal itself. And yesterday had been that moment. However, while the community huddled around Grandma with respect and dependence, Karen stood at the far end of the street, her posture tight, her expression carved from bitterness. She watched the way people gravitated toward Grandma, watched the way officials deferred to her land knowledge, watched the way the community had shifted in a single night, and deep inside her, something cracked louder than the pavement beneath the HOA office. She could not accept this new reality. To her, leadership was not earned, it was taken, enforced, demanded. Watching Grandma take it by simply existing made something dark and ugly swell within her. She gathered the remnants of her HOA board, only 3 members now, the rest having defected, and dragged them into a makeshift meeting in her driveway. She spread out papers, rules, bylaws, violation notices, and half-written amendments, her hands trembling not from fear, but from rage. She ranted about restoring order, regaining authority, reasserting HOA dominance. But her words rang hollow. Even the board members who remained loyal to her looked unconvinced, shaken by the collapse, unsure whether maintaining loyalty was bravery or foolishness. And that only infuriated Karen further. Meanwhile, Grandma walked the length of the community with the inspectors, showing them where the original irrigation channels used to run before the HOA rerouted them. She explained how the land had natural drainage systems long before the development was built. She pointed out inconsistencies in soil density, places where water pooled unnaturally, and even spots where she predicted new cracks might appear. The inspectors listened with genuine respect, taking notes and asking questions. Their acknowledgement of her expertise only further destabilized Karen's already fragile composure. By mid-afternoon, the county officials informed the community that a full geological assessment would be needed and that certain areas might need to be evacuated temporarily. This announcement sent a wave of fear through the homeowners. But again, they turned to Grandma for clarity, not Karen. And Grandma, with her steady voice, assured them that temporary relocation would likely help the land settle safely, preventing further collapses. Her calmness spread through the crowd like a balm. But when Karen heard that the landowner, her rival, her obstacle, her obsession, was being deferred to over officials, something inside her snapped entirely. She stormed toward the crowd, shoving her way between neighbors until she stood directly in front of Grandma, face flushed, eyes wild, voice cracking with desperation and fury. She accused Grandma of orchestrating the disaster, of manipulating the land intentionally, of sabotaging the HOA to gain power. She screamed that the sinkholes were a setup, that the community was being fooled by a master manipulator, and that the real threat was not the land, but Grandma. The crowd recoiled, stunned, not by her words, but by her instability. Some homeowners whispered to each other. Others watched with wide, sympathetic eyes, as though witnessing a complete unraveling. But Karen didn't stop. She paced wildly, waving documents in the air, raving about bylaws, insisting that Grandma be forcibly removed for endangering the community. Neighbors tried to calm her, but she shook them off, spiraling deeper into her belief that she was the victim of a conspiracy. The land shifted again, small, subtle, but enough to make everyone flinch. A loose stone rolled down the edge of the sinkhole near the HOA office. A fence post leaned a little more, but Karen didn't notice. She was too consumed by her meltdown. Finally, the county inspector stepped between Karen and Grandma, stating firmly that the HOA had no authority to enforce anything until the geological investigation was complete, and that for safety reasons, no one, especially Karen, should make any unilateral decisions. It was the final blow. The crowd watched as Karen's face twisted in rage, humiliation, disbelief. She tried shouting again, but her voice faltered, sputtering out like a dying flame. And then she fled, storming back into her house and slamming the door hard enough to rattle the porch railing. The community exhaled in a single, shaky wave of relief. That night, the homeowners gathered in small groups across the neighborhood, discussing plans to support one another during temporary evacuations. They exchanged supplies, offered guest rooms, and helped board up vulnerable spots. But above all, they continued gravitating toward Grandma's porch, where she sat on a wooden chair overlooking the land like a quiet sentinel. She offered guidance, reassured families, and mapped out potential risk zones. The atmosphere, though tense, felt united for the first time in years. But while the community found unity, Karen sank deeper into isolation. She spent the evening pacing her home, tearing apart drawers, flipping through HOA paperwork, searching for anything that could restore her control. But the deeper she dug, the clearer the truth became. The HOA no longer had power, not legally, not socially, not structurally, and in her desperation, she turned her anger into blame. Blame at Grandma, blame at the homeowners, blame at the land itself. She stood at her window long after sunset, staring toward Grandma's house with a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Her breathing was unsteady, her hands trembled. She whispered to herself that this wasn't over, that she would not let an old woman ruin everything she built, that she would reclaim her power no matter what it took. And in the pitch-black quiet of her now half-powerless neighborhood, Karen made a decision, one fueled not by logic or survival, but by obsession. She would confront Grandma directly, not with rules, not with warnings, but with something far riskier, far more unhinged, far more dangerous. And as the neighborhood slept uneasily, unaware of the storm gathering behind Karen's windows, the land shifted again, a quiet, subtle movement, like a breath being held. A warning, a tension, a sign, because the final collapse, the final reckoning, the final confrontation was now inevitable, and it would come not from the earth, but from Karen herself. The final day began with a deceptively peaceful sunrise, the kind that painted the sky in soft streaks of gold and pink, casting a gentle glow across the shattered asphalt and fractured sidewalks, as though trying to offer comfort to a neighborhood still trembling from the chaos of the night before. But beneath the warm colors and still air, there was an uneasy charge, an awareness that something inevitable, something final, was waiting to reveal itself. The land had been restless for days, and now even the insects seemed hesitant to move, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, anticipating the last stage of a transformation decades in the making. Homeowners emerged slowly from their houses, many with packed suitcases or hastily filled boxes, prepared to temporarily evacuate as recommended by the inspectors. They gathered in small, somber groups near the cul-de-sac, exchanging quiet reassurances while glancing nervously at the deeper cracks that had widened overnight. But even with fear hanging over them like a shadow, they looked toward Grandma's porch for guidance. And there she stood calm, steady, a grounding presence amidst the panic, surveying the land with the kind of understanding only someone rooted in it her entire life could possess. She could feel a tension in the soil, a final release building beneath their feet, a kind of pressure that had only one possible direction. Yet, even in the face of an impending collapse, she remained composed. Because she knew that sometimes the land had to break before it could heal, and sometimes a community had to fracture before it could rebuild. But Karen, locked inside her house, was not thinking about rebuilding. She was unraveling. She had spent the entire night pacing, tearing apart HOA binders, scribbling frantic notes, and muttering to herself about conspiracies and betrayals. The more the community rallied around Grandma, the more unhinged her thoughts became, spiraling into a single obsessive belief that Grandma was stealing the life she had built, the authority she had claimed, the power she had wielded for years. By sunrise, she had convinced herself that she had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. She emerged from her house with a wild, jittery determination, her hair unkempt, her steps uneven but purposeful. She marched toward Grandma's property, gripping a large folder of HOA documents as if they were weapons, as if paper could rewrite the truth of the collapsing land, or resurrect an authority swallowed by sinkholes and public humiliation. Neighbors watched with dread as Karen approached, their breaths catching in their throats, sensing that this confrontation would not be like the others. This one felt final, not because the community wanted it, but because Karen's spiraling obsession demanded it. Grandma turned calmly as Karen approached, the early light outlining her silhouette, highlighting the deep contrast between calm wisdom and frantic instability. Karen began shouting accusations again, frantic motions slicing through the air as she thrust the folder toward Grandma. She accused her of destroying the HOA, destabilizing the community, weaponizing the land, manipulating the residents. She claimed the sinkholes were planned, the panic intentional, the night's chaos orchestrated to strip Karen of her authority. Her voice cracked with desperation, each word trembling with the fragile remnants of a power slipping through her fingers like sand. The community watched, stunned and silent, as Karen spiraled into a tirade so intense it felt like the land itself recoiled beneath her feet. And then, as if timed with her collapse, the ground gave a sudden, thunderous shudder. It was not a rumble like before, not a warning, but a release. A final exhale of decades of suppressed instability. A deep fissure tore across the street between Karen and the community, splitting the asphalt in one violent motion. People screamed and stumbled backward as chunks of ground caved inward. A second crack shot across the side of Karen's yard, tearing through the decorative stones she had obsessively maintained, ripping her perfect lawn in half as if the land was rejecting the control she had tried to force upon it. Karen froze, eyes wide, staring at the collapsing ground as her reality splintered along with the earth. Her documents scattered in the wind, fluttering into the gaping fissure like fallen leaves. She stumbled back, shrieking in disbelief as the crack widened further, swallowing pieces of the walkway, the fence, and the edge of her porch. But the land spared her. It sent a message, but it did not consume her. And it was in that moment, as the final shockwave settled into a trembling stillness, that the community realized something profound. The land was not punishing them. It was correcting mistakes. It was pulling out the rot. It was reclaiming balance. The earth settled with a final groan, the air thick with dust and silence, as neighbors slowly regained their footing. Inspectors rushed in to assess the damage, their expressions shifting from panic to realization. The collapse had followed the exact lines of the HOA's irresponsible projects: over-irrigated areas, illegally modified drainage zones, and soil destabilized by years of mismanagement. Karen's home had not been targeted. It had simply been built on the most altered part of the land, the one she spent years forcing into artificial perfection. And now, the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Karen sank to her knees, staring at the fractured outline of her lawn, finally confronted with the consequences of the power she had abused. The community members gathered around Grandma, who stepped forward and addressed the inspectors with calm clarity, explaining how the land had reached this point, how it needed restoration, how it could be saved. For the first time, officials listened completely. They recognized her deep, generational understanding. They acknowledged her rightful ownership. They trusted her judgment, and as she spoke, the community stood behind her, not out of fear or obligation, but respect. Over the next several hours, emergency crews guided homeowners through temporary evacuation procedures, but their panic had shifted into something else: determination, unity, hope. They weren't running away this time. They were planning to rebuild, and they wanted to rebuild under new leadership. By late afternoon, the remaining HOA board members gathered the entire community near the safer, elevated part of the cul-de-sac. People stood in a wide circle, tired but resolute, as the board announced the official dissolution of the HOA, effective immediately. No more fines, no more harassment, no more forced compliance. The HOA era of Willow Hills was over. The crowd erupted into relieved cheers, some homeowners crying, others embracing, the weight of years of tension finally lifting like a heavy curtain. And then, something remarkable happened. Without prompting, without discussion, without hesitation, the community turned to Grandma, not to form another HOA, not to create a new ruling body, but to ask humbly for guidance. They wanted her wisdom, not her control. They wanted her experience, not her authority. They wanted her voice, not her rules. And she agreed, not as a leader, but as a steward, a guardian, a bridge between the land and the people who lived upon it. Karen, standing at the edge of the circle, watched with hollow eyes as everything she once commanded now flowed effortlessly toward the woman she had tried to evict. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't fighting. She simply broke. Her collapse was quiet, private, internal, a stunned acceptance that everything she had built was never real authority. It was fear disguised as power, and fear no longer worked in Willow Hills. By sunset, the community left together for temporary housing, walking as a united group past the fractured sidewalks and damaged lawns. Grandma remained on her porch for a moment longer, looking across the land that had shaped her life and now shaped her legacy. She knew the land would heal, and now, finally, so would the people. The neighborhood that had once tried to push her out now recognized her as the foundation beneath their feet. Not because she owned the land, but because she understood it, respected it, protected it. As the last golden light faded behind the hills, Willow Hills transformed not into a perfect community, but into a real one, a grounded one, a united one, and the land, for the first time in years, finally rested.